The atmosphere of the airport is electric, a living mosaic of movement and sound as travelers rush to and from their gates, announcements echo overhead, and luggage wheels clatter against polished floors. Among the throng of hurried passengers, a man stands with an air of quiet authority. He is impeccably dressed, his dark tailored suit hugging his fit frame, accented with a deep blue tie and polished leather shoes that click softly against the floor. Despite the frenetic energy around him, he maintains an unshakable composure, his long week of high-stakes meetings and critical decisions as the CEO of a renowned tech firm all reflected in the lines of determination etched across his face. The check-in line moves briskly, and as he approaches the desk, he adjusts the leather strap of his carry-on bag. His first-class ticket rests confidently in his hand, a symbol of his success, his hard-earned place among the best society has to offer. When his turn comes, the airline attendant glances up, at first with a welcoming smile that falters almost immediately as her eyes lock onto him. She scans his attire, his proud posture, and hesitates. Just for a moment, but long enough to carry the weight of judgment. Her voice, when she speaks, is polite but lacks the natural warmth she'd shown to the previous passenger. "Good afternoon, sir. May I see your ticket?" Her question is routine, her tone is not. Doubt cling to her words, as if to challenge the authenticity of the man before her. Handing over his ticket with a polite yet firm smile, he speaks in an authoritative tone. "Of course." Her eyes drop to the ticket and a terse frown creases her brow. She glances back up to him, hesitation flickering across her face. "This is a first-class ticket, Mr. Scott. I just need to verify something quickly." Without waiting for a response, she turns away, leaving him standing alone as other passengers glance curiously in his direction. He holds his composure, his calm demeanor masking an all-too-familiar frustration simmering beneath the surface. He knows what triggered her reaction. It's not the ticket or some technical issue, it's him, the color of his skin, which, in her mind, doesn't align with the luxury of first-class travel. Minutes tick by, each one stretching endlessly as the crowd behind him grows increasingly impatient. Finally, the attendant returns, her expression tight. "Mr. Scott, I'm afraid there's been an overbooking situation. We'll need to move you to economy for this flight." He blinks, absorbing the statement like a blow to the chest. She avoids eye contact, her explanation rushed. "It's a busy route, and these things happen. We'll compensate you with miles, of course." Had this been the first time, he might have erupted, demanded to see a supervisor, made a scene. But it wasn't. This wasn't a rare occurrence or an isolated misunderstanding. It was part of a pattern he'd encountered too many times in his life, success questioned, dignity undermined. With a composed yet firm tone, he responds, "I expect a follow-up regarding this issue." Avoiding further escalation, he accepts the new ticket begrudgingly and heads toward the boarding gate. Moments later, he finds himself squeezed into an economy seat, his broad shoulders barely fitting within the confines. Around him, the overhead bins snap shut as passengers settle in, and the pilot's voice crackles over the intercom with routine pleasantries. But for Mr. Scott, the humiliation of being displaced from the seat he'd rightfully purchased burns fresh and sharp. He opens his laptop, his fingers dancing over the keys as he dives into work, channeling his frustration into productivity. The flight takes off smoothly, the engines roaring as the ground falls away beneath them. Hours pass uneventfully, and just as Mr. Scott begins to lose himself in spreadsheets and emails, a sudden jolt throws the plane into momentary chaos. Drinks spill, passengers gasp, and the crew scrambles to calm the nervous chatter. The pilot reassures everyone over the intercom, blaming a patch of turbulence, but Mr. Scott's sharp eyes catch something unusual. From his vantage point, he witnesses the captain briefly step out of the cockpit, his demeanor uncharacteristically relaxed given the circumstances. Instead of conferring with the crew or appearing concerned, the pilot exchanges a few casual words with a flight attendant before disappearing back into the cockpit. Something about it feels off to Mr. Scott, a subtle but troubling negligence that sets his instincts on high alert. He knows aviation, having partnered with air travel companies before. Protocols exist for a reason, and this flagrant disregard could spell disaster. Determined not to ignore what he's witnessed, he flags down a senior flight attendant. "Excuse me, I need to speak with the captain immediately." His voice is calm but commanding, his tone leaving no room for debate. The attendant hesitates, caught off guard by his assertiveness. "Sir, it's best," she begins, but he interrupts. "I insist." After a tense pause, she nods reluctantly and disappears toward the cockpit. Minutes stretch into what feels like hours before the captain emerges, his expression one of annoyance masked by a thin veneer of professionalism. "What's the issue here?" the captain asks, his tone clipped. Mr. Scott rises from his seat, meeting the captain's gaze with unyielding confidence. "Let's discuss protocol and safety measures, Captain. Our lives and your career might depend on it." The cabin falls silent, curious eyes turning toward the unexpected confrontation. Tension hangs palpably in the air, the drama of the moment pulling everyone to the edge of their seats as they await what comes next. The captain's eyes narrow as he sizes up Mr. Scott, clearly caught off guard by the man's resolute demeanor. Around them, the cabin buzzes faintly with whispers as passengers steal glances toward the unfolding drama. Attempting to regain command of the situation, the captain folds his arms and addresses Mr. Scott curtly, his voice laced with irritation. "Sir, I assure you that all protocols are being strictly adhered to. There is no cause for alarm." Unmoved by the response, Mr. Scott's voice remains steady but firm, cutting through the captain's dismissive tone like ice. "With all due respect, Captain, your behavior following the turbulence says otherwise. As someone who has worked closely with aviation standards, I recognize when something doesn't align. I'm not here to question your authority. I'm here to ensure the safety of every single person on this plane." The conviction in his words halts the captain in his tracks. For a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crosses his face, but he quickly masks it with a defensive retort. "Let's not waste anyone's time with baseless concerns." Before he can finish, the senior flight attendant from earlier steps forward, her expression taut. "Captain," she interjects, her tone pointed yet deferential. "There's been increased passenger concern about the turbulence. Perhaps it's worth at least addressing it with the flight crew?" The captain hesitates, clearly unaccustomed to being contradicted, even indirectly. He shoots a sharp glance at the attendant, but her composed demeanor doesn't waver. With a sigh that borders on exasperation, he finally acquiesces. "Fine, I'll speak with the crew, but let's make this quick." Mr. Scott watches as the captain retreats toward the cockpit, his jaw tightening. While the exchange feels like a small victory, his instincts are still on high alert. Something is off, not just with the captain's actions, but with the very atmosphere of this flight. The subtle unease among the crew, the way minor discrepancies seem to stack up, it all points to a deeper issue brewing just beneath the surface. Seating himself once more, Mr. Scott glances around the cabin, assessing the scene. Many passengers still appear rattled, their conversations hushed and wary. A child nearby clutches her mother's arm, her wide eyes scanning the rows of seats and aisles as if searching for reassurance. The mother strokes her daughter's hair absent-mindedly, her gaze distant with worry. Determined not to let his concerns dissipate, Mr. Scott opens his laptop again, scrolling through his notes. Amid figures and schedules, his eyes land on a file buried in his archives, one from a past collaboration with a major airline. The quick reference guide outlines standard cockpit protocols, emergency procedures, and crew responsibilities. He skims through the document, his mind interweaving what he's reading with what he's observed. Frustration sharpens his focus as discrepancies become clearer. Just as a swell of realizations washes over him, a sudden commotion erupts a few rows ahead. A male passenger, visibly irate, rises from his seat, gesturing animatedly at an overwhelmed flight attendant. "This is unacceptable." His voice booms over the hum of the cabin. "First the turbulence, and now this neglect? What's going on up there?" The attendant stammers, trying to mollify him, but the man's anger cuts through her attempts. "I have every right to know if my safety is at risk," he exclaims, his voice rising with every word. Other passengers murmur, some siding with his demands, others urging calm. Mr. Scott observes closely, gauging the growing unrest. People are on the brink of panic, their nerves frayed by the uncertainty hanging in the air. Rising from his seat deliberately, he strides toward the tense scene. "Sir," he speaks calmly but authoritatively, his voice carrying a weight that instantly draws attention. The passenger stops mid-rant, his irritation pivoting toward Mr. Scott. "And who are you supposed to be?" the man snaps. "I'm a fellow passenger just like you, concerned for our safety," Mr. Scott replies evenly, "but creating chaos won't help any of us. Let's focus on ensuring this situation is handled appropriately." The tension in the man's stance begins to ebb slightly, though he doesn't fully relent. Mr. Scott turns his attention to the distressed flight attendant. Please let the captain know that his passengers require clear communication urgently. The attendant nods rapidly, retreating toward the cockpit without delay. Mr. Scott faces the restless passengers, his presence demanding attention without effort. We all have questions, he acknowledges, his tone steady. But panic won't solve anything. What will make a difference is holding the crew accountable. Calmly but firmly. Together, we'll ensure they uphold their duty to us. His words land with precision, the murmurs subsiding as a semblance of order begins to return. Even the disgruntled passenger appears mollified, though a shadow of doubt still lingers in his eyes. Mr. Scott exhales quietly, aware that his role in maintaining this fragile balance is far from over. The minutes drag on, a tense quiet enveloping the cabin. Then, just as people begin to settle back into their seats, the senior flight attendant returns, her face pale. She leans down to Mr. Scott, her whisper barely audible. "The captain wants to speak with you, in private." Mr. Scott's brow furrows, his heart rate picking up. Rising slowly, he follows her toward the front of the plane. The cabin watches in silence, passengers' eyes tracking his every step. As he approaches the cockpit, the captain stands waiting, his expression inscrutable, a mix of reluctance, resolve, and something else Mr. Scott can't quite place. "Mr. Scott," the captain begins, his voice low, "there's something we need to discuss, and it can't wait." The cockpit door clicks shut behind Mr. Scott, muting the murmurs of the cabin, but not the pounding of his pulse in his ears. The confined space is stifling, a far cry from the open luxury of his usual boardroom. The captain gestures toward the narrow jump seat near the control panel, his expression remains taut. Mr. Scott remains standing, his frame a confident counterpoint to the oppressive atmosphere. "What's this about, Captain?" he asks evenly. The pilot exhales sharply, clearly grappling with how to proceed. He glances toward the cockpit's co-pilot who, though silent, bears an expression betraying faint discomfort. The captain straightens his shoulders, avoiding direct eye contact. "Sir, as you've insisted on questioning our operations, I thought it best to personally address your concerns and dispel any misunderstanding." Mr. Scott leans forward slightly, arms crossed. "Then let's cut straight to it. During a turbulent section of this flight, I observed a breach in standard protocol. Your movements and demeanor lack the urgency or precision befitting a situation we passengers should feel assured about. I'm trying to determine if that oversight was an isolated lapse or the tip of something more concerning." The captain's composure falters for the briefest moment, his eyes darting toward the cockpit door as though reinforcements might barrel through to shield him. But no one comes. Turbulence is a common aspect of flights, Mr. Scott. Protocols are designed with flexibility in mind. Patrols have been adhered to, safeguards in place. As a passenger, your knowledge of our operations is limited at best. The words are delivered with the confidence of an individual accustomed to near-unchallenged authority. But Mr. Scott remains undeterred. "My knowledge," he responds, his voice sharpening, "is rooted in verifiable aviation work decades old. The subject matter isn't guesswork, Captain. It's vital security we can't afford to overlook during flights supposedly rooted in logistical mastery. Turbulence is common, mismanagement is not. Discipline and visible accountability strengthen the honest illusion all's coordinated." He pauses. Back row certainty guys consequence seeps elsewhere. Before, narrative looping doubts. War airprints, passengers began emerging stealthily nearby. Aligning consoles nod, measuring correctly involved truthful commands. Perfection, conspicuous occupied public example. Someone ignored unwittingly. Respect tailored executive footing. Cautious ground. Still innate listened. Growing relevance, notions parachuted internally, shield quicker acknowledgement, failing doubly understood alike. Cases requires unlimited associate implies occurrence. Odd much related predictations. Aspiration perspectives, insurers say. Partnership diverts. Immediate false success deemed. The room inside the cockpit was thick with tension, the kind that feels almost tangible, pressing its weight against the very air. Mr. Scott stood upright, his shoulders squared and his eyes unwavering as they locked onto the captain's. The co-pilot shifted uncomfortably in his seat, casting furtive glances between the instruments and his commanding officer. Outside the locked door, the muffled hum of the aircraft blended with the subdued voices of passengers, speculating on the surreal scene unfolding just beyond their view. "Mr. Scott," the captain began again, his hands gripping the back of his chair tightly as though grounding himself. You don't understand the complexities of what happens behind this door. There are strategic decisions that we have to make in real time. No passenger, regardless of their expertise or concerns, is in a position to question that. His voice rose slightly, betraying the pressure he was under, yet still layered with a tone of condescension. But Mr. Scott wasn't the type to be easily dissuaded, especially under pressure. He took a measured step forward, refusing to break eye contact. Each move he made seemed deliberate, his body language restrained yet brimming with quiet authority. "Captain," he began, his voice smooth yet commanding, "do not underestimate the intelligence of the people behind that door. Those passengers aren't ignorant sheep content to follow your lead blindly. They place their lives in your hands, but with that trust comes a responsibility to project confidence through competence. What I've seen so far undermines that trust, and your hostility only deepens this concern." The captain's face flushed at the critique, but before he could respond, the co-pilot spoke up, his voice tentative but clear. "He has a point," the younger man said, his eyes avoiding the captain's glare. "The turbulence earlier, it was standard, sure, but breaking protocol, stepping out while tensions were high, I'm not sure that was wise." The stark honesty from his co-pilot seemed to momentarily stun the captain. His jaw tightened as silence took over the cramped space. Mr. Scott allowed the moment to linger, watching closely as the captain's resolve fractured, piece by piece. Finally, the pilot exhaled, his shoulders slumping slightly under the weight of the admission he was fighting to suppress. "Fine," he muttered at last, his tone begrudging but edged with resignation. "You're right. I stepped out at a time when I shouldn't have. It wasn't a breach of safety, it's just, I needed a moment." For the first time since entering the cockpit, the captain allowed himself a moment of vulnerability. His finely polished armor revealed cracks beneath the surface. "I've been flying this route for years," he continued quietly, his voice heavy, "but lately it's been harder to focus. Pressure from the airline, overpacked schedules, family problems. It's like a constant storm." Mr. Scott didn't interrupt, though his gaze softened as the man went on. As someone who had scaled the corporate ladder shouldering biases, expectations, and staring down his own storm, she recognized in the captain a man at a breaking point. "I get it," Mr. Scott finally said, his voice no longer edge-sharp, now tempered with empathy. "Pressure can blind you, dull your instincts. But the stakes here? They're not just about meeting deadlines or dealing with personal stress. Lives are on the line. If you can't hold it together here, in this cockpit, you need to ask yourself if you're fit to be in this role for their safety and for your own." The captain froze, his breathing shallow as the weight of Scott's words settled over him like a blanket of judgment and truth. For a long moment, neither man spoke, the hum of the plane engines filling the void. Then, the senior flight attendant knocked gently on the cockpit door from the other side, breaking the quiet. The sound was a reminder of the world beyond their bubble, a world full of worried passengers awaiting resolution. The co-pilot broke the silence. "We need to address them," he said firmly, directing his gaze at the captain. However much he respected the chain of command, the young man seemed emboldened now, his earlier discomfort morphing into conviction. "They deserve at least that much after how today's played out." The captain glanced at his co-pilot, then at Mr. Scott before finally nodding. "You're right. Let's not drag this out any longer." Moments later, the cockpit door opened, and the captain stepped out into the aisle, flanked by the senior flight attendant. The cabin, which had grown deathly quiet in anticipation, erupted into hushed whispers as passengers craned their necks to watch the unfolding scene. Mr. Scott stood just behind, observing without inserting himself yet. This was the captain's moment, his chance to regain what had been lost. The captain paused halfway down the aisle and cleared his throat, the microphone in his hand trembling faintly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice projecting over the intercom and through the cabin simultaneously. "I want to take a moment to address the tension that's been building throughout this flight." His words were carefully measured, his tone softer than usual. "I realize that my actions earlier have caused concern. I want to assure you that the turbulence we experienced was well within our safety parameters, and there was no threat to the flight. That said, I could have handled the situation better, both professionally and for the comfort of those on board." Some passengers nodded, visibly relieved to have their fears directly acknowledged. Others, including the man who'd earlier lashed out at the flight attendant, simply crossed their arms, skepticism still firmly in place. The captain continued unabated. From this moment on, my crew and I will be transparent in our communication for the duration of this flight, and I thank you for your patience. Though the captain had said all the right words, Mr. Scott could feel the atmosphere in the room shift only incrementally. Trust, after all, wasn't rebuilt overnight, but a step had been taken, a small yet significant one. As the captain handed the microphone back to the attendant, his eyes met Mr. Scott's briefly. It wasn't an apology, not explicitly, but it was an acknowledgement. Unfolding himself from the shadowed corner of the cockpit, Mr. Scott returned to his seat. The turbulence in the room had subsided, but a lingering sense of watchfulness clung to him as he opened his laptop once more. His gut told him this wasn't over yet. After all, storms never dissipate with a single gust, they build quietly, waiting for the next strike, and this one felt far from finished. The captain's words, though measured and delivered with a controlled tone, seemed to have a dual impact on the passengers. Some visibly relaxed, their postures softening against the seatbacks as they exchanged subdued remarks. Others, like the disgruntled man from earlier, remained tense, their faces betraying lingering skepticism. The human dynamic in the cabin teetered between wary acceptance and an unspoken, shared vigilance. There was a sense in the air that, despite the effort to provide clarity, unease lingered, like an unfinished conversation hanging in a room. As Mr. Scott sank back into his seat, his thoughts raced. The flight had quieted once more, and the passengers around him began to recline, some even attempting to doze off. But his mind refused to rest. This was larger than a momentary lapse of protocol. Was the captain's admission of personal struggle all there was, or did it mask a deeper fault within the airline's operations? And why, despite the attempts at reassurance, did that unease continue to gnaw at him? Drawing out his laptop, Mr. Scott felt the charge of determination building within him. If trust in the system faltered, then someone had to ensure the integrity it promised to uphold. He needed answers. Logging into a private email server that only his most trusted partners had access to, he composed a quick message to a contact at a prominent aviation oversight organization, a man named Eric, whose expertise had proven indispensable to Mr. Scott on more than one occasion during high-stakes projects. Eric, need advisement on current flight protocols and overview policies for aviation safety procedures during in-flight anomalies. Observed deviations occurring on board. Request immediate guidance or available resources for further evaluation. Travel status restricted to in-flight details to follow. Regards, Scott. He hit send and leaned back, glancing toward the cabin walls that seemed to close in ever so slightly under the weight of his concerns. The hum of the engines provided a backdrop to his racing thoughts, the white noise only amplifying his focus instead of dulling it. Moments later, a soft chime sounded above his seat as the overhead console displayed an incoming notification on his private network. He clicked into the response from Eric, short but immediate. Scott, monitoring airspace advisory boards. Key anomaly thresholds typically tied to escalating flight risks include crew shifts, post-unreported turbulence, RO, event deviation priorities. Indicators might point toward conflict deeper than interpersonal anomalies, but defer safety's horizon, unraveled lead less visible officer negligence. Pass rank queries amicably intentioned without delegitimizing captain professionalism, overlap standard. Indiscretions window match interpreted occurrence, derail minimal adjustment. Advise subtle observational stance till landing, provided anomaly sustained, confirm approach. Regulation manifests. Okay. Best, Eric. Though technical, Eric's words were clear. This wasn't the type of situation that should be escalated through rash actions. Any further inquiry, at least for now, would have to be subtle and methodical. Mr. Scott exhaled, stretching his shoulders and opening his focus to the room around him. Then a soft but distinct sound broke through the cadence of murmured conversations and the steady drone of the engines. Somewhere behind him, startlingly faint but undeniably there, came the sound of restrained sobs. Glancing discreetly over his shoulder, he noticed a woman 2 rows back, her frame shuddering slightly as she pressed a tissue to her face. The man seated next to her leaned in, whispering words too low to hear while maintaining a steady hand on her shoulder. Mr. Scott focused carefully. Was this simply a private moment of personal difficulty amplified by the stress of travel? Or had something occurred that deepened her visible distress? Understanding the full context would require more tact than just walking back and asking outright. Before long, one of the flight attendants approached her row, crouching down low and maintaining hushed tones to keep their exchange muted to other passengers. Mr. Scott watched the interaction closely, noting the subtle but undeniable signs of concern etched across the attendant's face as she nodded sympathetically in response to the woman's muffled explanations. The attendant departed with practiced composure, heading toward the service area near the rear of the plane. Not long after, she returned quickly with another staff member and a discreet first aid kit. They angled themselves carefully as they attended to the woman, but their hurried movements and darting glances suggested that all was not entirely under control. Compelled to piece together this growing tension, Mr. Scott rose slowly from his seat. He moved with purpose toward the rear of the plane, pausing just short of the scene so as not to impose, but lingering within audible range of the hushed exchange. Her medication, it's supposed to be with her carry-on. She has to take it, the man pleaded under his breath, explaining something to the attendants. We can't find it. Please, it's not supposed to go this long. The urgent undercurrent of his voice sent a chill down Mr. Scott's spine. The flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances. We'll keep looking, one replied, noticeably avoiding eye contact. But airline regulations, certain checks, certain limits. The sentence hung awkwardly in the air, avoiding explicit choice words that might alarm passing passengers. This wasn't negligence over a minor mishap. It could crescendo into medical neglect aboard this flight. Stepping forward gently to bridge the unease without escalating prematurely, Mr. Scott addressed the nearest attendant. If it's an issue of misplaced items and logistics at boarding, his tone remained calm, pointed. You may find passenger Scott could offer mitigating solutions within stringent time. His offer's exact articulation rewired immediacy inside ideal memories before developing resistance. Prior isolated dramas failed. But even incisive tact blended tightly. Observer routines, operations, vocational deflection, smoother carrying, sense assembled politeness, who fluid professional intricacies, divergent oversight. It seems procedural and corrected plan engaging. Collective smoothers attempting failed compliance. Trivial easily. Formal plan progress. Crucial negativity revisiting anomalous evaluation. Logical reckon. The air in the cabin remained tense as Mr. Scott resumed his seat, though he couldn't shake the unfurling tension in his chest or the creeping feeling that events were spiraling into something much larger. The woman's distressed sobs 2 rows back had subsided, but their echoes lingered in his mind like a haunting refrain. He opened his laptop again, hoping to drown out the chaos with the familiar comfort of work, but focus evaded him. The softly pulsing cursor on the blank document before him seemed to taunt his inability to fully grasp the situation at hand. The passengers around him seemed to sense the unspoken unease, stealing furtive glances toward the back of the plane where the attendants clustered with the distressed couple. Even those who had settled into reclined positions with hopes of ignoring the noise began to sit up straighter, their conversations reduced to quiet murmurs. The man from the distressed couple rose abruptly from his seat, his movements sharp and frenetic as he spoke to one of the flight attendants, his voice just loud enough to carry. She needs her medication now. You said you'd keep looking, but all you've done is stall. This isn't just anxiety. It's serious. The attendant replied in a soft, placating tone, but her words did not carry the authority or assurance needed to diffuse the situation. Her hesitant demeanor seemed only to fan the man's frustration. The exchange became increasingly heated, their voices breaching the fragile bubble of false calm that had settled over the cabin. Other passengers began to crane their necks, their curiosity outweighing their hesitation to intervene. Mr. Scott finally closed his laptop with a quiet but definitive snap, his own frustration mounting. This wasn't just a matter of comfort or convenience anymore. Someone's well-being was rapidly deteriorating, and the crew's inability to act decisively was a glaring failure. Rising from his seat, he strode purposefully down the aisle toward the commotion. His imposing presence seemed to clear a path through the onlookers, their gazes trailing him as he approached the distressed man and the attendants. "Excuse me," Scott began, his voice carrying a calm yet unyielding authority that instantly commanded attention. He turned to the man, locking eyes with him. "I understand your frustration, and you're absolutely right to be concerned given the circumstances, but shouting won't help your wife get what she needs. Let's focus on solutions." The man, caught off guard by Scott's intervention, hesitated but nodded, taking a step back as Scott addressed the flight attendants. What exactly is the issue here? Has the medication been located? The lead attendant, a woman in her late 40s whose crisp uniform betrayed the strain in her furrowed brow, hesitated before answering. Sir, we've checked the couple's seats and luggage but haven't found the medication. It's possible it ended up stowed with the other carry-ons, but it's not listed on the manifest as being reported to us. Scott cut her off gently but firmly. Let's not waste time with speculation. Have any additional searches been conducted beyond their immediate belongings? And have you consulted the airline's emergency procedures for dealing with medical issues on board? The attendant faltered, clearly unprepared for such a direct line of questioning. We haven't yet gone through all the overhead bins, she admitted reluctantly, and protocol advises us to… She paused, her tone faltering. Protocol advises you to act promptly when a passenger's life might be in jeopardy, Scott finished, his words razor-sharp and unyielding. His tone wasn't angry, but it carried an unmistakable edge of urgency. I'd suggest enlisting additional crew members to conduct a thorough search of the overhead bins immediately. If the medication isn't located, your next step should be contacting the captain and requesting clearance for an emergency response. The attendant blinked, momentarily stunned by Scott's command of the situation, before hastily nodding. Yes, of course, let me speak to the team right now. She gestured to one of her colleagues, and the two disappeared toward the front of the plane. Thank you, the man murmured to Scott, his voice betraying a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. I don't know what we would have done. Save your thanks, Scott replied, cutting him off with a small wave of his hand. Let's focus on making sure she gets the help she needs first. He turned his attention to the woman, leaning down slightly so his soft words wouldn't disturb the concerned passengers watching nearby. Ma'am, I know you're feeling overwhelmed right now, and I can't imagine how difficult this must be, but help is on the way. Can you tell me anything else about the medication? A name, perhaps, or what it treats in case we need to radio for assistance? She hesitated, tears welling in her eyes, but managed to choke out through uneven breaths. It's for my heart. Angina, pain, nitro, but tablets. Scott's brow knitted as her words confirmed his growing fears. Nitro tablets, used to treat chest pain, weren't just important. They were essential. Her medication could mean the difference between life and death in the event of a cardiac event. He filed the information away, sure that it might be crucial in the moments to come. He straightened, scanning the cabin for signs of progress. The attendants had begun speaking with the captain near the front of the plane, their bodies angled toward the cockpit door. Their hurried movements and brief terse exchanges did little to inspire confidence. And then, as though carried by the tension in the room, a sound reached Scott's ears that shot ice straight through his veins. The faint but unmistakable chime of the captain's overhead announcement system being activated. Passengers straightened, their eyes snapping toward the speakers in anticipation. This is your captain speaking. The words hung, ominous and uncertain, as though their weight threatened to suffocate the fragile calm Scott had fought to maintain. We have a situation developing that may require immediate action. Scott's heart sank. The quiet murmur of the cabin was broken only by the distant hum of the engines and the hushed whispers of passengers exchanging worried glances. Mr. Scott sat straight in his seat, every muscle in his body tense like a coiled spring. Around him, passengers fidgeted with their seatbelts and shifted in their seats, their unease thick in the air. The captain's announcement, brief and foreboding, had shifted the atmosphere entirely. What kind of immediate action would the situation require? And why had the tone of the captain's voice held such gravity as if even he couldn't suppress his apprehension? From his vantage point, Scott could see that a few flight attendants had gathered near the galley, speaking in low tones as they occasionally cast glances toward the cockpit. Their expressions were tightly controlled, but their body language betrayed them stiff shoulders, nervous glances, and the way they stuck close together like a herd unsure of where danger might come from next. The faint sound of an intercom beep sounded again, pulling everyone's attention toward the cockpit door. The captain's voice returned, his tone professional but devoid of its earlier confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, due to a medical situation on board, we are prioritizing finding immediate assistance for one of our passengers. Please remain seated as we continue to address this matter. I ask for your cooperation and understanding. His words were clear, attempting to maintain calm, but the tension in his delivery was unmistakable. This wasn't a routine announcement. Something more was at play. Scott glanced back at the distressed couple 2 rows behind him. The woman looked pale now, her breathing shallow as she clutched her chest. Her husband hovered over her, his features tight with worry. One of the attendants crouched next to them, murmuring words of reassurance, but her darting eyes betrayed her nervousness. The woman's condition was worsening, and the crew's efforts to find her medication were proving futile. Scott rose from his seat again, his movements deliberate despite the anxiety coiled in his chest. He approached the attendant nearest to the couple, speaking in a low but firm tone to avoid alarming the other passengers. "Where are we with the search? Have you located the medication yet?" The attendant shook her head, her hands clasping the tablet used for passenger records. "We've searched the overhead bins in this section and checked the manifest twice. There's no record of the medication. The captain is considering whether we need to divert the flight to the nearest airport, but that's still being discussed." "There's no time to debate," Scott replied sharply, his voice cutting through her hesitation. "This woman doesn't need a decision 10 minutes from now. She needs help immediately. If the medication can't be found, have someone relay the exact details of what she needs to emergency personnel on the ground so they can be ready for her the moment we land. And in the meantime, consult your medical kit. Do you have any emergency substitutes?" The attendant hesitated, clearly out of her depth. "The med kit." She began, but Scott interrupted her gently but firmly. "Do it now," he ordered, his tone brooking no argument. She nodded quickly and hurried toward the galley as Scott turned his attention back to the couple. The husband looked up at Scott, fear stark in his eyes. "She can't hold on much longer," the man whispered hoarsely. "Please do something." Scott placed a steadying hand on the man's shoulder. "We're doing everything we can," he said firmly, his composure unshaken despite the gnawing doubt clawing at him. He glanced toward the front of the plane, where the captain and first officer were likely deliberating their next move. In moments like these, Scott knew, time was the most precious commodity, and it was rapidly slipping away. As he turned back toward the aisle, a shrill cry pierced the air. "She's not breathing!" the husband exclaimed, his voice cracking as panic overtook him. The cabin erupted into chaos as passengers stood, craning their necks to see what was happening. The attendants rushed toward the couple, their faces pale as they attempted to tend to the unresponsive woman. The lead attendant gripped the intercom handset. "We need a doctor. If there's a medical professional on board, please identify yourself immediately." For a moment, the cabin was plunged into a terrible silence, the only sound the muffled sobbing of the husband and the rasping breath of the flight attendants working to revive the woman. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed looks, voicing their concern in low murmurs. And then, from the back of the plane, a man stood middle-aged, with the air of someone accustomed to carrying authority. "I'm a cardiologist," he said, stepping briskly down the aisle. "What's the situation?" Scott stepped aside, allowing the doctor access to the woman. The cardiologist quickly assessed her condition, his movements brisk and efficient. "Is there nitroglycerin on board?" he demanded, addressing the lead flight attendant without looking up. The attendant's expression faltered. "You don't believe so," she stammered, glancing nervously at Scott. "There's a medical kit," Scott interjected. "It's being retrieved now." The cardiologist nodded tersely. "We'll need it immediately. If her angina isn't addressed now, it could escalate into a full-blown heart attack." The attendant rushed back toward the galley as the doctor continued working, instructing the husband to elevate the woman's legs and keep her airway clear. Scott hovered nearby, his presence both calming and commanding as he relayed the doctor's instructions to the crew. The seconds ticked by with excruciating slowness, each one stretching into eternity as the woman's labored breaths filled the air. Scott's mind raced, analyzing the situation and silently willing the attendants to return with the kit. And then, just as the tension in the cabin reached a breaking point, the lead attendant appeared, clutching the white medical bag in her hands. The doctor snatched the kit and quickly rummaged through its contents, pulling out a vial and syringe. His hands moved with practiced precision, mixing the medication and administering it while the passengers watched with bated breath. The woman's husband gripped her hand tightly, his lips moving silently in prayer. And then, after what felt like an eternity, her chest rose and fell more evenly. Her complexion, pale and ashen moments ago, began to regain a faint hint of color. The doctor pressed his fingers to her wrist, counting her pulse before nodding. "She's stabilizing," he announced, his voice steady but laced with relief. A collective exhale swept through the cabin, the tension dissipating like steam rising from boiling water. But for Scott, the reprieve was short-lived. He locked eyes with the lead attendant, his expression grim. Notify the captain. We'll need emergency medical services on the ground as soon as we land. This isn't over. The cabin lights had dimmed to a serene glow, casting elongated shadows across rows of passengers still trying to digest the events of the last hour. Despite the temporary calm, the air was thick with a palpable tension, one that whispered of unresolved fears lurking beneath the surface. Mr. Scott sat rigid in his seat, his eyes trained forward as he processed every detail of the situation like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. He couldn't shake the feeling that all of this, the turbulence, the captain's behavior, the medical emergency, was part of a larger story yet to be told. The woman who'd nearly succumbed to her medical condition was now resting with the cardiologist seated by her side, keeping vigil with quiet professionalism. Her husband clung to her hand as though she might slip away if his grip faltered. The flight attendants, visibly rattled but trying to regain their composure, moved cautiously through the cabin as if stepping on shards of glass that could shatter further with the wrong move or word. Passengers whispered to one another in hushed tones, some still throwing lingering glances toward the cockpit with suspicion. Scott's focus shifted to the front of the plane. The captain hadn't emerged since his cryptic announcement. The cockpit door remained firmly shut, a barrier between the answers Scott sought and the mounting questions that refused to be silenced. Why had the captain resorted to such a vague explanation? And why did the co-pilot, whose earlier hesitation had betrayed unease, seem so reluctant to engage with the passengers again? Just as the cadence of tension seemed to ebb, a sudden flurry of activity drew Scott's attention to the aisle. The lead flight attendant appeared from the galley, her face pale but her steps purposeful as she approached Scott directly. She leaned in close, her voice pitched low enough to prevent eavesdropping. "Mr. Scott, the captain has requested you join him in the cockpit once more." Scott's brows furrowed, but he gave a curt nod, rising from his seat. Whatever this was, it likely wasn't good. He followed the attendant down the aisle, aware of eyes tracking his every step. He could feel the unease of the passengers around him, their unanswered questions hovering heavy in the space they shared. Reaching the cockpit door, the attendant placed a hand on the intercom to signal their arrival. A mechanical buzz preceded the click of the door unlocking, and Scott stepped inside, the door sealing shut behind him. The confined space of the cockpit felt even more oppressive this time, despite the subdued lighting of the control panels casting a warm orange glow. The captain sat in his chair with his hands clasped tightly before him, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. The co-pilot, by contrast, appeared tense, his fingers drumming nervously against his armrest. The only sound was the subtle hum of the plane's instruments until the captain cleared his throat, his voice breaking the uneasy silence. "Mr. Scott," he began, measuring his words carefully, "we find ourselves in an unprecedented situation, and your insight earlier compelled me to make this request. I need your help." Scott folded his arms, his piercing gaze locked onto the captain. Beneath the pilot's composed exterior, Scott could see the threads of doubt unraveling. "Help with what exactly, Captain?" he asked, his words deliberate. The captain hesitated, glancing toward the co-pilot before continuing. "I didn't want to broadcast this over the intercom for obvious reasons, but following the earlier turbulence, we've been tracking a minor but unusual issue with one of our hydraulic systems. It hasn't escalated into an emergency, but the indicators are starting to drift outside acceptable margins. With this woman's medical emergency, we're facing a critical decision. Continue to push to our destination or divert immediately to the nearest airport." Scott's stomach clenched. Hydraulic issues were no minor inconvenience in aviation, especially at cruising altitude. They were a precursor to something potentially catastrophic if left unchecked. The captain's indecision, combined with the clearly deteriorating state of the woman they'd nearly lost to a medical episode, hung like lead in the room. He stepped forward, bracing himself against the edge of a control panel. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Scott said, his voice quiet but piercing. "You're managing a potential systems malfunction while a passenger in critical condition waits for emergency care, and yet you're debating whether to continue flying." The captain stiffened at the thinly veiled criticism, but before he could protest, Scott pressed on. "Correct me if I'm wrong, but airline protocol you've emphasized to me several times today dictates that passenger safety supersedes all other considerations. You don't have the luxury of time or second chances here, Captain. You need to act." The co-pilot finally broke his silence, his voice tinged with nervous urgency. "Scott's right. The margin for error is razor thin, and if this hydraulic issue worsens, our options will narrow significantly. We should initiate a diversion now before it becomes a forced emergency landing." The captain's jaw tightened as he weighed their words. A slight tremor in his hand betrayed the storm raging behind his composed expression. At last he let out a sharp exhale, his decision made. "Fine," he said curtly. "I'll notify the control tower to set up an emergency diversion, but I expect full cooperation from the passengers. We can't afford panic." Scott nodded, though his mind was already racing ahead to what came next. The captain picked up the intercom handset, his announcement deliberate and controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We will be diverting to the nearest airport due to a combination of technical and medical considerations. Please remain seated and follow all crew instructions as we make our descent." As the announcement ended, Scott glanced at the cockpit instruments. The truth hung heavy in the air. They were heading into uncharted territory, where the threads of control holding everything together felt precariously thin. Back in the cabin, the murmurs of passengers grew louder, the growing realization of what was happening rippling through the crowd. Returned to his seat, his presence steadying those around him, even as uncertainty loomed large. The hum of the engines shifted subtly as the plane began its descent, carrying with it the weight of a question still unanswered. Would they make it in time, or was this just the beginning of another storm to come? The plane's descent continued, growing steadily sharper as the engines altered pitch, a subtle yet unmistakable reminder that they were leaving cruise altitude and heading into an emergency diversion. The cabin had grown eerily quiet apart from the occasional cough or whispered exchange. Passengers clung to their armrests, their faces reflecting various shades of anxiety and confusion as they processed the captain's announcement. Even the most seasoned travelers couldn't fully hide the tension pulling at their expressions. First, turbulence, then a medical emergency, now technical failure. For many, this flight had become a trial in patience and faith. Mr. Scott, seated rigidly, tapped methodically at his laptop. His mind worked furiously to analyze the sequence of events, replaying the captain's words, the strange lapses in procedure, and the unease rippling under every layer of this flight. There was too much converging at once. A confluence of failures that no experienced executive like him could chalk up to mere coincidence. As much as he tried to focus, distractions loomed in the background. The hum of anxious voices, the still pale figure of the woman who had narrowly escaped a medical crisis, and the occasional glance from the flight attendants who seemed to regard him as much a part of their authority chain now as the captain himself. The sudden ping of his laptop jolted him back. A reply from Eric. Clicking it open, Scott read carefully. Scott, review ongoing. Essential to determine historical maintenance logs on hydraulic systems aboard current aircraft. Possible indicator of deferred servicing clashing with routine operational wear/fatigue. Recommend questioning delays in reporting known pre-flight issues if applicable. Administration-level inquiries post-landing. Remain poised. Momentum likely escalates next intervals, especially given multi-threat complications, medical, tech overlap. Reminder. Ensure safeguards for yourself amid environmental strain. Eric Scott inhaled deeply. Eric's words confirming a growing suspicion he hadn't wanted to admit. Their situation might have roots in failings that extended well beyond the single flight. His knowledge of operations from the boardrooms of aviation firms told him that deferred maintenance and operational corner-cutting often appeared harmless until they weren't. When emergencies cascaded, they rarely stemmed from isolated incidents. Systems faltered because of fissures long ignored. He closed his laptop, his instincts roaring to get back to the cockpit. But before he could rise, a flight attendant suddenly approached, her face pale, her movements brittle with tension. Leaning closer, she whispered, "Mr. Scott, the captain has requested another word with you." Immediately. Scott nodded and stood, brushing past rows of tense passengers who turned their heads to follow his progress down the aisle. The unspoken questions their gazes carried. What's he doing? Who even is he? Seemed almost deafening in their intensity. Reaching the cockpit, the attendant keyed in the access code. The muted click of the lock released, followed by the faint pressure differential of the sealed chamber opening. Inside, the tight quarters radiated stress. The captain was hunched over his instrument panel, beads of sweat visible at his temple, stark against the glow of the dashboard's various flickering indicators. The co-pilot, rigid and methodical, worked quietly alongside him, yet Scott could feel the tension rolling off of him in waves. This was not the air of a team in calm command. This was the controlled edge of people grappling with a situation just beginning to slip beyond their reach. The captain turned his head slightly, acknowledging Scott without making full eye contact. "I've made contact with the tower. The diversion airport is San Jose International, 30 minutes out with clearance expedited for emergency landing. But here's the issue." He broke off, glancing at the co-pilot as though searching for an anchor before finally continuing. "The deviation in our hydraulic system, it's widening." Scott didn't need to be an aeronautical engineer to understand what worsening indicators meant. Marginal tolerance could edge sharply into system breakdown under the wrong circumstances at altitude. "So what's the next contingency?" Scott pushed, his voice calm despite his racing thoughts. "I've got protocols mapped. We're running controlled pressure management procedures to slow potential system degradation, but with the added weight redistribution from diverted fuel dumping." The captain paused, catching himself and shaking his head. "What I mean is, I'm confident in our current plan, but if I'm being honest, Mr. Scott, landing under deteriorating performance metrics requires precision. Absolute precision." Something in his tone struck Scott as almost confessional, a rare window into the mounting pressure that even the frontmost authority figure wasn't immune to. The co-pilot chimed in. "We're working the redundancies, but it's all about timing. A late error, we're in trouble. An early engine thrust flare under palms." Scott tilted strategically direct reassurance. "Hold them. No excess audience beyond cockpit responsible channel test. Tail intervention roadblock transiting outside. Striking concentration balance, convergence. Landing, foreign pressures, scattered logic, simplifications, removal, nor chain redundant, counter-blame guilts, cutting narrative nerves areas, dominant handles indirectly avoided fatal fringe losses. Interim retroactive implements concurrently connect application scenarios, calibrate felt altogether center. Position anchoring claims, spiraled weaker recalibrations, visible paramount heading. Final ellipse trials, knowingly sync, single bridge, long cutoff. Anchorly remainder spoke final, halfway dial, loop cautiously indispensable. Circle plot, ready resolve runway checks. The specifics still felt head clutch developed, confirmed engineered transmissions calibration, predicted intervals approach, range outer highly counterphone, awaiting repetitive opportunity threshold rising, serum descent. Earliest message. The sharp descent into San Jose International had flipped the calm of the cabin to an edgy expectancy, like the pregnant pause before a thunderstorm. Passengers clutched their belongings, white-knuckled, some leaning forward, seeking answers in the turbulent shadows playing on the seatbacks before them. Mr. Scott sat still, but his shoulders tensed, his sharp gaze cutting through the shifting tide of apprehension in the room. At this altitude, clarity was far more important than comfort, and the truth about what was transpiring on this plane stretched ahead of him like an unfinished script waiting to be written. The hushed murmurs intensified when the captain too updated over the intercom. The hydraulic system issue was now publicly framed as a minor anomaly, but Scott knew from his earlier discussion in the cockpit that the truth roamed dangerously close to catastrophe. Words like margins and monitoring were thin shields against the real stakes at hand. Passengers rattled their concerns, trading short bursts of fear disguised as insight. "What does that even mean?" someone asked roughly 2 rows ahead. A woman clutched her toddler closer, while a businessman in an expensive suit whispered into his phone, his voice taut with unease. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, every polite smile and placating phrase a thin veil over the tension lacing their posture. Scott's focus hadn't wavered from the larger picture. This wasn't just the combined stress of several emergencies stacked together. The questions he'd started asking himself since the turbulence earlier bubbled higher, frothing against the backdrop of inadequate answers. Deferred maintenance? Protocol slippage? Or systems grinding under years of operational oversight turning corners too tight? Finally, the lead flight attendant approached him again, whispering with hurried breath, "We've received protocol clearance for emergency landing procedures, sir, but Captain Hollis has instructed that we distribute safety instructions. Hayes asked that you help address some of the passengers." Her tone hesitated on the last few words, as if reluctant to admit even to herself that a passenger was on track to embody steadiness their chain of authority failed to replicate publicly. Scott nodded succinctly, not out of arrogance but clear pragmatism. The chain's cracks were as glaring as its need for someone to fill them. Standing tall, he motioned her towards the attendant's microphone, while stepping further along visible access rows, congregating nearer visual audience margins, subtly leaning, strengths observed neutral mass, calming fluctuations. Stepping forward from the low-hung informational murmurs, Scott positioned his voice precise, towering unmatched wavering air-coded passengers. Expectations seemingly flared, careful line threading, clarity acknowledgement urgency. It carried without pleading. Ladies and gentlemen, ensuring utmost priorities remain. Holding securable inputs. Fully strategic safety. Section. Redirection. Mutual executed. Regular updates reiterated. We together smooth maintain together optimum resolve. Allocating actions. Bill correctly ending increments. Promisingly cooperatively adjusted. Reached fields shortly mitigate sequences. Fully officer reconstructed rights. Valued punctuality zones. Same world replies. Witnessed meanwhile conserving bandwidth. Versatile corners. Aeration fixture. Roadmap implications. Dissolve predictabilities. Unsafe nodes prematurely tackling opportunistic wavelength assurances. Synchronously twice. Importantly, collaboration teamwork. Top spotless short-off precedences. Moment collective dignity. Modeled ahead. Gesture. Oriented lengths. System. Clear. Immediate proportional restoration. Above sustained. Essential decelerate. Forthcoming safeguarded results. Extracted. Minimizes group dilutions. Universally, unit overall oxygened. Non-fragments intersect. Disappoint. Unequal sides. Elevated. Encountered thin. Step pensively anchored exteriorly. Corrections alighting. Surpass boundaries. Compromised. Influencing pivot. Angular systems. Uplift every. Glad cut option aligns. Executive service resonance. Keeps worlds robustly observed. Marqued. Spinable redux. Narrative shortened into linear adaptable shock. Considerations. Humbles. Simple willingness. Strengthened faith. Enhancing West. Approaching telephonics. Air safety wills. Additive, relying reached. Assured fully. Halting adjustment. Tremoring steps surveyed lands. Active standfastedly. Complications oppressing prominence. Agreements. Consciously prediction. Gradually mirroring suffusions. Optics. Voluntary keeping. Again exactingly reducenced particles. Quantum optimum lay. Metal joint equities embracing nimble continuity. Circulates deliberate relatable long marks. Crash counter permissions. Securing warmly radiate life. Sift courteous null zone. Downward maximizing timings. Held post-clear lateral transitional obtained credits. Aft relief civil truthful. The smell of sterile sanitizers filled the emergency response terminal of San Jose International Airport. As the aircraft finally came to a halt on the tarmac under the pale gleam of airport floodlights, a wave of partial relief rippled through the cabin. From the window seats, passengers strained to catch a glimpse of the emergency response vehicles that had gathered in anticipation of the high-stakes landing. Ambulances, fire trucks, and airport security vehicles clustered near the gate like sentinels prepared for the worst. Yet, inside the plane, tension still hung heavy. Mr. Scott remained seated near the front, his hands clasped and jaw clenched as a silent witness to the unfolding events. The woman who had nearly succumbed to her medical emergency was being carefully prepped for transport by paramedics who had entered the plane escorted by flight attendants. Her husband hovered nervously beside her gurney, gratitude and lingering fear etched into every line of his face. The cardiologist, now visibly drained, barked a few final instructions to ensure her care would transition seamlessly off-board. Scott couldn't ignore how quiet the captain had remained over the intercom since their descent had begun. Every word that hadn't been said was now a vacuum, amplifying the lingering questions passengers weren't bold enough to raise directly. The hydraulic issue hadn't devolved further during the descent, yet neither had the crew addressed the cause or resolved the deeper concerns Scott had been chewing over since they'd first left cruise altitude. This wasn't over, not truly, and he could feel it in the unspoken resonance of every moment. A quick announcement finally buzzed through, this time from the flight attendants. Passengers were to remain seated until instructed to disembark row by row. Despite the professional tone, it was impossible to miss the undercurrent of agitation. Diversions brought questions. Questions brought scrutiny that Scott knew firsthand from business and from life could make systemic cracks impossible to conceal. The paramedics wheeled the gurney forward, moving methodically toward the nearest exit. Gasps rippled faintly as passengers caught glimpses of the woman's frail form. It was relief, sadness, and guilt coalescing as a mirror to the vulnerability of being human, of flying and entrusting themselves to forces largely beyond their control. As the couple disappeared down the exit ramp, Scott's fixation shifted back to the cockpit. He had left too much unsaid in his earlier conversations with the captain. The hydraulic issue was no minor anomaly. It was a red flag. Combine that with diverging tensions between the captain and co-pilot, the frazzled state of the flight attendants, and the broader operational decisions by the airline that had allowed such convergence to occur, and it was clear there was a much bigger narrative behind everything that had unfolded on board. Standing finally, Scott moved with measured calm toward the forward galley. A few passengers turned their heads as he passed, curiosity flaring. Reaching the cockpit door, he exchanged a controlled nod with one of the attendants stationed there. Her eyes betrayed hesitation but not surprise. The cockpit door opened just enough for him to slip inside. He was greeted by the confined, dimly lit space that had served as the theater for the flight's most confidential tension points. The captain, Captain Hollis, swiveled to face him as Scott entered. If the captain had been conflicted earlier, now he just appeared bone-weary. "I take it this isn't just to wish me a safe farewell?" Hollis muttered, his voice low but betraying an edge of defensiveness. The co-pilot didn't turn, choosing instead to focus on post-landing diagnostics still streaming across their consoles. No, Scott didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I'm here because what occurred on this flight can't end here. On this tarmac, in front of a welcome committee of medical responders and safety vehicles. There are questions that still need answers, not just from me but from every passenger who trusted you to bring them safely to where they need to be." The captain sighed, his forehead tight with frustration. His hands gripped the arms of his seat tightly, the knuckles whitening. "You're implying a lot, Mr. Scott. We landed safely. The medical emergency is being handled. The hydraulic pressure stabilized well enough for us to get down without incident. As far as the record will show, this flight will be marked complete." There was barely concealed finality in his tone. Scott's expression remained neutral, but his voice cut through the muted hum of the cockpit instruments directly. "Well enough isn't good enough, not for you, not for your co-pilot, your crew, or your passengers. You know better than anyone that aviation doesn't leave room for near misses. Near misses are unspoken warnings ignored until the inevitable tipping point hits." The captain opened his mouth to retort, but Scott wasn't finished. He crossed his arms, his unyielding posture an immovable counterweight to the defensive atmosphere radiating from Hollis. The sheer convergence of failures today couldn't have been isolated. You stepped out of the cockpit during turbulence, not protocol prime regardless of severity. A medical incident was pushed onto a passenger-provided sense of intervention long before the situation met the captain's set, standard speed escalations amongst crisis normalizations under operational upkeep. Hydraulic warning signs stretched partially deferred diagnostics. Don't tell me cutting hallway pressure was grounded inputs. Window, regular unchecked divergence breakdowns, systemic unknown sequences. At this, the co-pilot finally glanced up, his tension now dissolving into something closer to reluctant agreement. Hollis hesitated, his frustration now replaced with resignation as it fully settled just how many threads had unraveled under his watch. Silence filled the space for several beats before Hollis finally muttered lowly, more to himself than Scott, "A system stretched thin. It doesn't excuse it, but these margins." Scott nodded grimly, reading between the lines. "Margins slip, protocols bend, but consequences don't." His words hung heavy, giving the captain pause one final time. Mr. Scott's firm yet composed demeanor hadn't faltered since the wheels of the plane touched the tarmac, but the weight of unresolved questions continued to press against him like the walls of the cockpit earlier. The hydraulic system issue, the unattended protocol breaches, the unspoken systemic cracks threatening to splinter under the guise of normalcy. Despite reaching the relative safety of San Jose International, Scott knew that the air of resolution among the passengers was a temporary illusion, a mirage conjured by relief rather than concrete answers. The sound of the cabin door swinging open snapped Scott's thoughts back to the present. The faint cold breeze from outside poured in, and passengers shifted forward slightly, eagerness sparking in their postures. The flight attendants moved swiftly to expedite the disembarkation, their movements measured but hastily executed, as if the act of ushering people off the plane could somehow wipe the slate clean of the precarious events that had preceded their landing. Scott remained seated, his gaze tracing the movements of the passengers as they filed past him. He observed their faces, searching for signs of lingering unease or relief. Some murmured to one another in hushed tones. Others focused on transferring the grip on their belongings from hand to hand like a subconscious reassurance that they had survived. The world outside the cabin beckoned them with its bright lights and the promise of solid ground beneath their feet. Yet for Scott, it was not so simple. Across the way, the woman who had suffered the medical emergency earlier was being carried out on a stretcher by paramedics. Her husband followed close behind, his head bowed as though he carried the combined weight of the flight's chaos on his shoulders. The cardiologist who had stepped forward during the crisis lingered near the exit, speaking quietly with one of the emergency responders before finally making his exit. Their departure, though orderly, was a stark reminder of how precariously close the flight had come to outright disaster. As the cabin emptied further, Scott rose from his seat, his presence commanding without effort. His intention was clear. He headed back toward the now-fixed cockpit door, catching the attention of the lead flight attendant stationed nearby. She paused, concern flickering briefly on her face as she intercepted him. "Mr. Scott," she said, her voice low yet insistent, "the captain and first officer are completing their post-flight reports. I'm afraid I can't let you—" Scott cut her off gently but decisively, his tone unyielding yet polite. "This conversation isn't about placing blame or interfering. It's about understanding what went wrong today so nothing like this happens again." He glanced pointedly toward the cockpit door. "Now, do me the courtesy of passing along my request." Nervous but unable to push back against the quiet authority in his voice, the attendant nodded and stepped toward the cockpit. Moments later, the door clicked open again, allowing Scott to step through for what he knew could be the final confrontation with Captain Hollis and his first officer. The atmosphere inside the cockpit hadn't changed much from when Scott was last there. Same stifling air, same dim lighting, same oppression of unspoken acknowledgement dampening the room. Hollis sat stiffly at his chair, arms folded, a forced neutrality masking the weariness evident in his eyes. The first officer, meanwhile, looked more like someone who had been walking a tightrope during the flight and was now seeing the ground edge closer but not close enough yet to relax. "Back again, Mr. Scott?" Hollis finally said, his voice bearing a sharp edge of irritation. "I assume this isn't a plea for an autograph?" Scott met his gaze without flinching. "This isn't a debate about personalities. There's a larger story here, Captain. One that doesn't end just because this plane reached the ground in one piece." Hollis sighed, leaning back in his chair for just a moment before springing forward, his hands gripping the armrests. "Fine. You want the truth, the uncomfortable truth you're so good at dragging out?" The aviation industry is stretched to its breaking point, and today, this flight, it's a symptom. Deferred maintenance cycles, overstretched schedules with crews flying beyond safe fatigue limits, corners cut behind closed doors to keep shareholders happy while safety standards teeter on the edge. That's the reality, and you know it as well as I do. Scott let the words hang in the air, a confession laid bare under the hum of the cockpit's dormant systems. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, deliberate. "Knowing it and ignoring it are two very different things, Captain. Knowing it and taking responsibility, addressing it. Those are where solutions begin. The passengers who walked off this plane might not know what it took to land them safely tonight, but I do. And I won't let those failures vanish into bureaucratic reports no one reads." The first officer, for the first time, spoke up, his voice hesitant but clear. "He's not wrong, Captain. We all see it. Flight after flight, the gaps." Hollis raised a hand, silencing him. "Enough!" His tone carried exhaustion more than authority this time, his eyes locked on Scott. "Do whatever you feel you need to, Mr. Scott. Push your reports. Call your contacts. But just know this: our system isn't built to bend forever. Fly enough storms and something eventually breaks." Scott nodded, sensing that the conversation had reached its conclusion. He stepped back, turning toward the cockpit door. Hollis's words echoed uncomfortably as he returned to the no-empty cabin. The plane had emptied, but the storm wasn't over. Not yet. As the last echoes of departing footsteps faded into the sterile quiet of the vacated cabin, Mr. Scott lingered alone in the aisle. The empty seats, the smooth hum of the engines winding down, the faint scent of antiseptic laced with lingering anxiety, all of it formed a tableau that seemed to pulsate with the weight of unspoken truths. He could feel it, a deep and resonant tension, hanging like stretched wires ready to snap. Outside, the flashing lights of emergency vehicles danced erratically across the runway. The captain's earlier words, raw, weary, ominous, echoed in Scott's head, fueling his determination. Fly enough storms, and something eventually breaks. It wasn't just a statement of warning, it was a confession wrapped in defeat. And though they had landed safely tonight, Scott knew one thing for certain. This wasn't merely a storm weathered. It was the prelude to something much darker looming just beyond the horizon. As Scott stepped toward the open cabin door, now flanked by a pair of ground crew personnel quietly coordinating the disembarking process, a flash of movement caught his eye. One of the flight attendants, the same lead attendant whom he'd spoken with during the flight, was walking briskly toward the galley at the front. Her beleaguered expression betrayed no visible sign of relief despite the ordeal being behind them. Instinct drew Scott after her, his long stride quietly closing the distance as he approached, just in time to hear her muttering into her radio headset. "Captain's directive, but no follow-up from ground crew yet," she whispered, voice taut with suppressed frustration. "They're asking for the log discrepancy report. I don't have any of it." Hollis said it wasn't worth filing mid-flight. Her back stiffened when she noticed Scott standing just a few feet away, his shadow cutting a sharp angle against the galley wall. "I'd like to speak with you," Scott said evenly, his voice firm yet devoid of judgment. She hesitated, glancing toward the cockpit door as though weighing whether any conversation with him fell outside her jurisdiction. But then, with a small exhale of what might have been resignation, she nodded. Away from the ears of the ground personnel and the scattered few flight crew still tidying the cabin, Scott leaned against the bulkhead and lowered his voice. "What's the real story here?" The lead flight attendant blinked at him, her hands curling into the fabric of her uniform skirt. Her professional mask remained intact, but beneath it simmered an undercurrent of outrage barely contained. "It's not my place," she said carefully, though her words rang hollow to Scott's practiced ears. "Except when safety is at stake, it is exactly your place," Scott countered, his tone calm but piercing. "The medical incident, the turbulence, the hydraulics, the erratic chain of command. I don't need access to the flight logs to know this flight was dangerously mishandled. I want to know, did the captain ignore warning signs before we even took off?" Her hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her headset, fiddling with the volume dial even though the channel had gone silent. After a long pause, she finally answered, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Mr. Scott, there were maintenance concerns flagged during pre-check, nothing unresolved on paper, but—" Her hesitation was palpable, like each syllable dragged unwillingly into the open. "Sheesh, but it wasn't routine." Captain Hollis dismissed it, said scheduling delays wouldn't allow for further inspection, it would disrupt the airline's profit margins. Scott's jaw tightened, his suspicions finally crystallizing. Deferred maintenance, rushed departures, corners shaved within tolerable limits, all to keep the industry's relentless clockwork churning. He thought of the passengers, families with children, professionals returning home, retirees heading to long-awaited vacations. They hadn't signed up to be chess pieces moved recklessly around a profit-driven board. Seeing the storm brewing in his steely gaze, the attendant pressed a hand to his arm. "I know it's wrong, but this isn't just about Captain Hollis. We're under so much pressure. Every trip, it's something: reduced budgets, overstacked schedules, equipment left operating past its prime. And if anyone raises complaints, we're labeled as the problem. The system's breaking, Mr. Scott. It's not just this flight, it's the entire airspace." The words landed heavier than any turbulence could have. Scott nodded tightly, releasing her from his gaze as his mind clicked through the next series of actions he needed to take. "Thank you," he said simply, recognizing her bravery in speaking even that much. Without another word, she stepped aside, leaving him to navigate the growing storm alone. Outside the plane, Scott emerged into the biting night air. The tarmac was a hive of activity, but somehow it all felt muffled, like the world existed under a thin veil that blurred sound and movement. The passengers who'd exited earlier were now clustered near the terminal, some stretching stiff limbs, while others rowdily recounted their terrifying experience to nearby journalists, eager for a sensational story. Nearby, Hollis conferred with airport staff, his body language defensive as he gestured sharply toward the plane. Scott ignored the chatter and instead reached for his phone. Within moments, he had dialed Eric's private number, his trusted contact in aviation oversight. When the line clicked open, Scott wasted no time. "Eric, it's Scott," he said tersely, pacing alongside the edge of the tarmac. "San Jose International. Emergency diversion, inbound flight 423. We need to start pulling maintenance records immediately, hydraulics, turbulence protocols, all of it." The situation today wasn't just a coincidence. It was systemic rot unchecked. "Passenger lives are at risk. This can't wait." Eric's voice came through steady, though seasoned with gravitas. "Understood. I'll get my hands on everything we're authorized to access, and maybe a few things we aren't. Are you safe?" "For now," Scott replied, though his gaze wandered toward the looming shadow of the grounded plane. A safe landing was no longer enough. Justice wasn't passive, it demanded pursuit, action, accountability. "But safe isn't the point anymore, Eric. This storm, they won't see it coming until it's already here. I'm making sure they feel it before it's too late." Eric's response was swift. "I'll dig. Keep me updated." As Scott ended the call and pocketed his phone, the faint roar of an engine starting up drew his attention. Another flight, lit like a comet in the dark sky, taxied toward the runway, oblivious to the now-grounded plane's silent warnings. Scott's jaw hardened as he turned, his stride purposeful as he crossed the tarmac. The battle for answers and accountability had only just begun. The dimly lit emergency room at San Jose International buzzed with clinical precision as the medical team worked tirelessly over the medevac patient. Paramedics exchanged brisk instructions while the doctor who had intervened on board filled in key details. Mr. Scott stood at the far edge of the partitioned room, observing the flurry of activity. After ensuring that the woman was stabilized, her husband finally approached Scott, his face lined with both fatigue and gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," the man began, his voice crackling with emotion. "We were about to lose her." Scott held up a hand. "Save your thanks for when she's back home safely. The team here is doing their job now." His eyes softened slightly. "And I'm glad we could at least get her to the ground in time." The man nodded mutely, retreating back to his wife's side without further words. Scott looked back toward the runway through the curtained partition. The plane, his battleground of truth and tension, now sat dark and vacant in an isolated corner of the tarmac. Its blackened silhouette against the night sky almost seemed like it wanted to dissolve into anonymity. Moments later, Scott's phone buzzed in his pocket. He stepped away from the terminal lights and answered quickly. "Eric," he said brusquely. "Scott!" Eric responded immediately, his voice carrying an urgency that matched the call's gravity. "I've been digging into the maintenance records like you asked. You're not going to like what I've found. This aircraft, the one you just landed on, was flagged 3 weeks ago for minor hydraulic anomalies, documented during a pre-flight check at LAX. Your captain's not wrong about systemic pressures. Those anomalies were waved off with filed deferrals for future investigation. Deferred thrice, to be exact." Scott's fingers drummed against the railing of the outdoor walkway as he processed this. "And I assume those deferrals were marked as safe for continued operation," he said flatly, his voice devoid of surprise yet tinged with simmering anger. "Exactly." Eric's tone darkened. "Safe enough on paper, but it's clear this isn't an isolated instance. Deferred maintenance has been quietly rising across multiple routes from this carrier. Internal memos I managed to access hint at cost-cutting measures aimed at increasing profitability. They're balancing on a knife's edge, but you and I both know how quickly that can go wrong." Scott exhaled sharply and leaned against the cool metal railing. His suspicions were no longer suspicions, they were facts. This airline was playing a deadly game, prioritizing budgets over lives, and it had nearly cost more than one person their life today. "Eric, I need everything," Scott said with measured determination. "Every deferred record, every memo, every single piece of evidence you can legally, or not so legally, get into my hands." Eric hesitated only briefly before replying, "Consider it done. Give me a few hours." Hanging up the call, Scott's thoughts shifted back to the captain. Hollis's confessions inside the cockpit were only a scratch on the surface of a fractured system. It wasn't enough for him to confess that the system was failing. Scott knew the accountability needed teeth. But how much resistance would this face from the airline's executives if they were pushing their crews to this brink? Returning indoors, Scott kept his expression neutral yet focused as he navigated past clusters of passengers huddled near the airport's concessions. Many were still buzzing about the tense moments aboard the flight. Conversations oscillated between relief and brewing outrage. One man, the business traveler who had muttered earlier on the plane, now spoke animatedly to a small crowd. Hydraulics, they said. That's not some seatback tray not locking into place. This was life-threatening. We should have known sooner. Scott continued walking toward the terminal's operations desk. The manager on duty was a wiry man with thinning hair who wore an outdated uniform, his face as wrung out as the day's emergencies. He had the wary expression of someone accustomed to angry customers, not high-stakes interrogations. Scott's sharp presence loomed as he approached. "You were informed about Flight 423's diversion and the reasons surrounding it," Scott said evenly, wasting no time on courtesies. "I need to speak with whoever oversees safety compliance for your carrier locally." The manager balked momentarily before nodding. "Sir, I'll reach out to our compliance officer right away, but honestly, this situation..." He gestured helplessly toward the rest of the terminal. "I'm just trying to handle what's in front of me. Give me a moment." Scott crossed his arms as the man fumbled with his radio, wisely avoiding the curious looks of passengers milling nearby. As he waited, his phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Eris, it was a number he didn't recognize. Pausing, Scott answered cautiously. "Scott!" A sharp and authoritative voice crackled on the line. "This is Alexandra Ng with the Federal Aviation Oversight Division. We were tipped off about today's flight and your involvement. I'd like to discuss your observations." Scott's brow furrowed. "You move fast," he replied dryly, though he was already angling toward a quieter bench in the terminal where the call wouldn't be overheard. "When reports include potential system-wide protocol failures, we don't waste time," Ng countered. "I understand you've witnessed multiple operational lapses during this flight. Can you confirm?" Scott paused briefly, recalling every detail with clinical precision. Confirmed. This plane had deferred maintenance tied to its hydraulic systems, flagrant bypassing of safety protocols by its captain, and a crew operating under pressure that compromised judgment. There was a brief silence on Ng's end before she replied, "My team will begin an immediate audit. Brace yourself for pushback. These carriers don't like their profits poked at. But your testimony could be pivotal in escalating this issue." Scott nodded to himself as he terminated the call. Pivotal was an understatement. This wasn't just about one flight. This was about uprooting systemic negligence before it became a harrowing headline with mass casualties attached. A sudden commotion near the terminal entrance snapped Scott's attention back to reality. Airport security and a few airline representatives appeared to be intercepting reporters trying to approach passengers for interviews. Among the chaos, a reporter flagged Scott's presence, their determined trajectory making it clear they had singled him out. Before the journalist could reach him, Scott straightened his posture, his gaze steady and unflinching. He wasn't ready to play media spokesperson yet, but the storm's center had shifted, and it was clear to him now that his role went beyond passenger or CEO. Whether by choice or force, he had become a catalyst for change. The weight of what was to come loomed heavily over him, but as the floodlights illuminated the plane once more, Scott's resolve steeled. He would see this battle through. For the passengers of Flight 423, for future flights yet to take off, and for an industry desperate for accountability, even if it refused to admit it. As the terminal lights began to dim slightly with the late hour, Mr. Scott sat alone in a quiet corner of the airport's executive lounge, his laptop glowing softly in the otherwise subdued space. Around him were the remnants of chaos. Newspapers with bold headlines about Flight 423's dramatic emergency landing were scattered on coffee tables, their sensationalist tones calling for immediate reforms in the aviation industry. On the other side of the glass walls, the faint roar of jet engines broke the silence, reminders that while today's flight was grounded, the world still moved forward. But for Mr. Scott, remaining grounded wasn't an option. This wasn't over, far from it. His mind replayed every moment of the last 24 hours. The flight, the condescending clerk at the ticket counter, the turbulence that felt like an eerie prelude to the failures that came after, the woman who nearly lost her life because of a misplaced medication, the captain's unwilling confessions, and, most damningly, the systemic rot he'd begun to uncover. No, this wouldn't be just another line item in an aviation safety report buried in thick bureaucratic jargon. This was a storm that needed a name, and Scott was determined to make it heard. His email inbox pinged. Eric's name glowed in the sender field. Scott clicked it open and scanned through the brief but damning contents. Attached were scanned logs, internal memos marked as confidential, and flight maintenance records for the specific aircraft involved in Flight 423. Each document painted a damning picture: deferred maintenance, unresolved checks flagged as low priority, and emails between executives subtly pressuring ground crews to keep operations smooth to avoid delays. It was all there in black and white. Scott's lips pressed into a thin line. These weren't isolated incidents. They were deliberate decisions. Choices made to value profit over safety, the bottom line over human lives. It made his blood burn with quiet fury. He closed the email cautiously and twisted his chair to face the large window overlooking the gates. There, shrouded in darkness, the plane responsible for this debacle was still parked motionless. It seemed almost apologetic, as if its metallic frame bore the guilt of human error. Scott leaned back and considered his next steps. His contact with Eric had already brought attention from aviation oversight bodies, and Alexandra Eng's interest from the Federal Aviation Oversight Division meant this would gain some institutional traction. But Scott knew all too well how systems protected themselves. Being vocal, pushing reforms, rattling giants, those were moves that came with consequences. He wasn't naive to the reality that stepping out into this storm meant he'd likely paint a target on his back. His musings were interrupted by the low hum of chatter nearby. Two men in suits had entered the lounge, each carrying an air of corporate authority. Executives, by the look of them. They exchanged curt nods with the staff before settling at a table not far from Scott. Their tones were hushed, but Scott's sharp ears picked up key phrases: public relations nightmare, damage control, and media containment. Scott narrowed his eyes slightly, his mind calculating. These weren't just any passengers. They were most likely representatives from the airline itself, sent to manage the blowback from Flight 423's botched journey. His instincts told him that their presence wasn't coincidental, and the pieces began to align. The airline wasn't waiting passively for this storm to pass. They were already strategizing on how to spin the narrative and deflect accountability. Standing quietly, Scott approached the pair, his movements measured but deliberate. His presence alone commanded attention as the men looked up, their expressions shifting from casual annoyance to faint discomfort when they realized who he was. "Gentlemen," Scott began, his tone courteous but underlined with steel. "I couldn't help but overhear some of your conversation. Public relations, is it? Damage control? Managing containment? It seems the airline has its priorities well organized." The older of the two executives straightened in his chair, his composure stiffening. "Mr. Scott, isn't it? I believe I've heard your name brought up in connection with today's developments." His attempt at sounding diplomatic was undercut by a slight edge of irritation. "Rest assured, the airline takes all matters of passenger safety very seriously. We're conducting a full internal investigation as we speak." Scott smirked lightly, though there was no humor in it. "I'm sure you are. And what will that investigation conclude? That the system performed as expected under extraordinary pressure? That delays and deferred maintenance were within operational thresholds? Let me save you some time. This isn't going to disappear." His voice dropped slightly, becoming sharper. Passengers' lives were gambled with today. Operational shortcuts nearly cost them everything. If you don't see the systemic failures here, you're not looking hard enough. The younger executive shifted uneasily, glancing at his colleague for guidance. "Mr. Scott, while we appreciate your candor, these are matters the airline will handle internally. There's no need to escalate this beyond what's reasonable." Scott stepped forward slightly, the intensity of his presence silencing the room. "Reasonable? Is that the word you use to cut corners? To silence those who raise alarms about safety? Reasonable ends the moment lives are put at risk. This isn't just about handling things internally anymore. I have the records. I have the evidence. If it's exposure your company fears, then exposure is what you'll get." The gravity in his voice hung between them like a blade. The older executive's jaw tightened, his mask of professionalism slipping briefly to reveal irritation. And was that fear? Before he could respond, however, Scott turned on his heel and walked away, his stride purposeful. He had planted the seed, and now he would see how far their resolve went when the pressure was turned up. As he exited the lounge, his phone buzzed again. Another message from Eric. It was brief. "New info attached. Call when ready." Scott thumbed the screen absently, knowing what awaited him, yet determined to push forward. Each step carried him closer to the storm center, and he welcomed it. The fight for accountability wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The terminal was oddly silent as Mr. Scott walked determinedly through its empty corridors. the dimmed lights casting shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. Hours had passed since the dramatic landing of Flight 423, and while many had moved when either retreating into their routines or reporting on the night's events, Scott's mind remained tethered to the system-wide cracks the flight had exposed. He wasn't finished, not yet. The fight for accountability required more than just bold words. It demanded undeniable action. With his laptop bag slung over his shoulder, Scott exited the main terminal and entered the cold night air outside San Jose International. His car, a simple yet efficient sedan rented for this trip, sat parked under one of the flickering lampposts. He climbed in but didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, he reached for his phone, dialing Eric's number without hesitation. The line picked up after only one ring. "I hope you're ready for a long night," Eric's gravelly voice came through the speaker, laced with a mix of urgency and weariness. "Lay it out for me," Scott said, cutting straight to the point. "I've cross-referenced the logs from Flight 423 against the broader maintenance data for the airline," Eric replied. "The hydraulic issue isn't just a one-off. It's systemic. 25% of the fleet has reported similar warning signs in the past year, all deferred under cost-saving measures. And the internal communication? It's damning, Scott. Executives are pushing for optimizing schedules while urging maintenance teams to minimize unnecessary downtime. They've practically written a recipe for disaster." Scott's jaw tightened as he absorbed the information. He was no stranger to corporate greed. It was a beast he'd wrestled with throughout his career. But seeing it play out so brazenly in an industry where lives were at stake was another level of malfeasance. "What about the captain?" Hollis admitted pressure from the top. "But do we have anything connecting his decisions to specific directives from above?" Eric's keyboard clattered faintly in the background. "I've got a few threads. Emails sent to captains and crew emphasize adhering to schedules and minimizing delays, but the language is just vague enough to avoid legal culpability. It's clear Hollis isn't the source of the problem, it's company culture. They're stretching everyone too thin, from pilots to ground crews, and now we're seeing the cracks turn into full-on faults." Scott exhaled sharply, leaning back against the headrest. "We need to escalate this, Eric. Oversight agencies, legal entities. It doesn't matter. This can't stay buried. I'm pulling a team together to compile all the data into a comprehensive report," Eric assured him. "But be careful, Scott. Once this hits, the airline's going to come for you. They won't just roll over." "They can try," Scott replied, his voice steel, "but they won't succeed." Ending the call, Scott started the car and pulled out of the lot, his mind working ahead to anticipate the moves he'd need to make next. He considered his options carefully as the city lights blurred past him. The airline wouldn't just sit idly. It would fight back with PR spin, legal maneuvers, and subtle intimidation. Scott had seen it all before, but he wasn't about to back down. Another call came through as he reached his hotel. The caller ID showed Alexandra Ung. He parked in a quiet corner of the lot and answered. "Ung," he said curtly. "I just got word from my team," she began, her tone direct. "We've received preliminary documents from Eric. If even a fraction of this holds up under scrutiny, we're looking at severe violations. But Scott, I need to know, are you ready for this fight? These are billion-dollar corporations. They don't lose easily." "I didn't get where I am by playing it safe," Scott replied. "This isn't just a fight for principle, it's a fight for survival. If we let this slide, the next incident won't end with an emergency landing, it'll end with lives lost." She paused, as if weighing his resolve. "All right, my team is moving forward. We've flagged this for a federal review. Be prepared for blowback." "Always am," Scott said before ending the call. He sat quietly for a moment, the enormity of what lay ahead settling heavily on him. But instead of feeling daunted, he felt focused, his resolve hardening under the weight of responsibility. Inside the hotel, the receptionist nodded politely as Scott passed through the lobby, his thoughts too preoccupied to respond. In his room, he set up his laptop on the desk, the glow of the screen illuminating documents Eric had sent over. Scott's sharp eyes scanned each emails, maintenance reports, scheduling logs. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and what they revealed was clear. This airline had gambled recklessly with safety, and he intended to make them pay for it. As he worked, his phone buzzed incessantly, calls from reporters, messages from concerned colleagues, and predictably, an email from the airline's legal team. It was thinly veiled as polite outreach, but carried an undertone of veiled threats, warning him against disclosing confidential company matters. Scott smirked grimly. They were scared, and he intended to keep it that way. But just as he prepared to shut his laptop and finally rest, an alert flashed across his screen, a breaking news notification. A headline blared in bold letters. Inside the flight that exposed an airline's dirty secrets. The story had broken. Somehow, journalists had gotten their hands on the initial leaks. Scott's pulse quickened as he clicked on the article. It detailed much of what he already knew, but was embellished with passengers' accounts, dramatic retellings of the landing, and speculation about the airline's practices. The storm was here, and there was no going back now. As he leaned back in his chair, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Eric, simple yet chilling. "Brace yourself, they're coming." Scott's eyes narrowed, his determination unwavering. Let them come. He was ready.